If you ask a disagreeable person what he wants, say, or she wants, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so agreeable that they often don't even know what they want, because they're so accustomed to living for other people and to finding out what other people want and to trying to make them comfortable and so forth, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. And that's not, look, there's situations where that's advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career. That just doesn't work at all. And so even though on average men and women aren't that much different in terms of their levels of agreeableness by the group, if you go out and you look at the extremes, they're very different. So all of the most agreeable people are women, and all of the most disagreeable people are men. And the thing is, the extremes are often what matter rather than what's in the middle. And so one of the ways that's reflected in society, by the way, is there's way more men in prison. And the best personality predictor of being imprisoned is to be low in agreeableness. It makes you callous. Now you may think, well, what's the opposite of compassion and politeness? And the answer to that is, I think it's best sort of conceptualized as a trading game. So let's say that we're going to play repeated trading games. And if you're very agreeable, then you're going to bargain harder on my behalf than you're going to bargain on your own behalf. Whereas if you're very disagreeable, you're going to do the reverse. You're going to think, I'm in this trading game for me, and you are going to take care of your own interests. Where an agreeable person is going to say, no, at best this is, at worst this has to be 50-50, but I'd like to help you every way I can. One of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. And I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And so that just doesn't work so well in that actual world. And one of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy, people come to psychotherapy for multiple reasons, but one of them is they often come because they're too agreeable. And so what they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. And one of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There's going to be things you think are nasty and harsh, and they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. And you need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. And it's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict. Not at all. They smooth the water. And you can see why that is in accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. And if you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you also may be loath to engage in the kind of high intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term, because it takes a lot of conflict to solve problems in the short term. And if that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the waters smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy, right? Because lots of times there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. And the advantage to having a well-socialized disagreeable person is that they really don't let much get in their way. So if you can get a kid who's disagreeable socialized, that person can be quite the creature, because they're very forward moving in their nature and very difficult to stop. But if you don't get them successfully domesticated, tamed, roughly speaking, by the time they're 4, their peers reject them. And that's a big problem, because your job as a parent is to make your child socially desirable by the age of 4. Like you want to burn that into your brain, because people don't know that. That's your job. And here's why. It's easy if you think about it carefully. So you imagine you've got a 3-year-old child, so sort of halfway through that initial period of socialization, and you take that child out in public. Okay, what do you want for the child? Who cares about you? What do you want for the child? You want the child to be able to interact with other children and adults so that the children are welcoming and smile and want to play with him or her, and so the adults are happy to see the child and treat him or her properly. And if your child's a horrible little monster because you're afraid of disciplining them or you don't know how to do that properly, then what they're going to do is they're going to experience nothing but rejection from other children and false smiles from other parents and adults. And so then you're throwing the child out there into a world where every single face that they see is either hostile or lying. And that's not something that's going to be particularly conducive to the mental health or the well-being of your child. If your child can learn a couple simple rules of behavior, like don't interrupt adults when they're talking too much and pay attention and try not to hit the other kids over the head with the truck any more than is absolutely necessary, then and share and play properly, then when they meet other kids, the kids are going to try out a few little play routines on them, and that's going to go well, and then they're going to go off and socialize each other for the rest of their lives. Because that's what happens, is that from 4 years old onwards, the primary socialization with children takes place among other children. And so if the kids don't get in on that early, they don't move into that developmental spiral upwards and they're left behind. And you can imagine how terrible that is, because a 4-year-old will not play with another 4-year-old who's 2. But a 5-year-old certainly will not play with a 5-year-old who's 2, right? Because the gap is just starting to get unbelievably large. And so the kids start out behind, and then the peers leave them behind, and then those kids are alienated and outside the peer group for the rest of their life. Those are the ones that grow up to be long-term antisocial, right? They're already aggressive. It doesn't dip down. Now, what happens to normal boys, roughly speaking? Imagine the aggressive 2-year-old types. They get socialized, so their level of aggression goes down, and then they hit puberty and testosterone kicks in, and bang, levels of aggression go back up. And so that's why males are criminals between the ages roughly of 16 and about 25. So, and it matches the creativity curve, by the way. It's so cool. If you look at the spike of creativity among men, 16 to 25, and it starts to go down, criminality matches that absolutely perfectly. So that's quite cool. So, the testosterone levels raise the average level of aggression among men. It's more dominance than aggression, actually, and testosterone is by no means all bad. And then it starts to decrease at about age 25 or 26, which is usually when men stop staying up late at night, stop drinking as much, develop a full-time career, and take on the burdens and responsibilities and opportunities that are associated with a long-term partner and family. It's really useful to investigate the viewpoints of people who have opposing views to yours. Because they'll tell you things, not only will they tell you things you don't know, they'll also tell you how to see the world in ways that you don't see it. And they'll also have skills that you don't have, that you could develop. So for example, if you're an introverted person, it's very useful to watch an extroverted person, because the extroverted person has ways of being in the social world that aren't natural to you, that you can use to improve your toolkit. And if you're disagreeable, one of the best things to do with disagreeable people, especially if that's alienating them from other people, for example, because it can, people treat you like you're a selfish, arrogant son of a, maybe that's because you are. It's like, okay, so what do you do about that? One of the most promising treatments, let's say, for that is get the person to do something for someone else once a day, just as a practice, and learn how to do it. Maybe you can wake the circuit up, if you think that it's lying dormant in you, which is probably right. I think we have a very wide range of propensities within us. Some are switched on, genetic propensities. Some are switched on, but I think that if you put yourself in the right situation or walk yourself through the right exercises, you can switch some of these other things on as well. But it takes work and dedication and discipline. I would say, generally speaking, if you want to adapt yourself properly to life, you should find a niche in the environment that corresponds with your temperament. Right? You shouldn't work at cross purposes to your temperament, because it's just too damn difficult. But having done that, then you should work on developing the skills and viewpoints that exist in the space opposite to your personality, because that's where you're fundamentally underdeveloped. And that way I think you can extend out your temperamental capability across a wider range. And to me, that's roughly equivalent as bringing a richer toolkit to each situation. So if you're hyper extroverted, you should probably learn to shut up at parties now and then and listen just to see what's going on, to see if you can manage it, And if you're introverted, well, then you should learn how to speak in public and to learn how to go to parties without hiding in the corner and saying nothing to anyone. And if you're agreeable, then you need to learn how to be disagreeable so people can't push you around. And if you're disagreeable, you need to learn how to be agreeable so that you're not an evil son of a bitch. So, and the same thing applies even in the conscientious domain. It's like if you're too conscientious, you need to learn to relax and let go a little bit. And if you're unconscientious, it's time, like, Get out the Google Calendar, man, and start scheduling your day, right? And beat yourself on the back of the head with a stick until you're disciplined enough so that you can actually stick to something for some length of time. It's very difficult to calibrate how many units of physiological preparedness you should manifest per unit of threat, right? Because how big's the threat? And the answer is, you don't know. You wake up in the morning and you have an ache in your side. Is that nothing? Or is that the cancer that's going to kill you in 6 months? And it's pretty low probability that it's the latter, but the probability is not zero. So why shouldn't you be panicked out of your mind? And the answer is, some people are. And sometimes they're right. So the calibration of threat, especially when it's associated with novelty, is an impossibly difficult computational problem. We have like 10 different mechanisms to try to solve that. And one of the mechanisms is, well, there's tremendous variability in response. And if you're higher in trait neuroticism, you're going to have the problem you're described all the time. You're going to be doubtful about your competence and the validity of your position. And the only treatment we really know for that is to expose yourself to things that you're afraid of voluntarily and to become braver as a consequence of doing that. But some people have to live with that more than other people.
The thing that I realized was that after a while, if you continue to disprove your imposter syndrome in the real world, you have a challenge, you're adamant that you probably won't or might not or don't deserve to get past it, and then you do, after a while, you have to admit to yourself that your imposter syndrome has nothing to do with your capacity and everything to do with your addiction about feeling like an imposter. And
well, and that does change as people age. Generally speaking, they become more agreeable, more conscientious, and lower in negative emotion. And some of that is that adaptation. You see that you've survived through various challenges, and then you can review that evidence to yourself, but also the people around you bolster you because they have confidence in you, and so their anxiety doesn't trigger your anxiety, and they'll remind you too, you know, you got this, you've done things in the past.
Such a wealth of data, you know, you've done it so many times. And I think,
and that does help. I mean, it does help. People get more confident as they get older, and they accrue experience because of that. But it's subject to that underlying trait variability and sensitivity to negative emotion. I mean, there's been good psychometric analysis of self-esteem scales and neuroticism scales, and they're pretty much the same thing, reversed. And so, are you confident in yourself? Self-esteem. Do you lack confidence? Trait neuroticism. And so it is harder for some people because it takes more evidence for them to dampen down their response to threat. So, and it's partly because we're all adapted to some degree to the failure of induction, right? Just because something happened multiple times in the past does not mean necessarily that it will happen the next time. And that's it's the farmer and chicken problem, right? Farmer's always feeding the chicken. Chicken thinks the farmer's his best friend, but one day the chicken is dinner. And that's induction. There was a stable pattern in the past. You come to rely on it, but at any time that axiom can be disproved. And so the fact that we have variability in trait neuroticism is a consequence of the probability of the failure of induction. It's a very difficult problem to solve, how to regulate negative emotion, you know. But I would say that the best way we know is to keep facing challenges voluntarily, pay attention at a rate that works for you, develop your competence. That actually stabilizes the environment around you, so it actually is less predictable and less threatening. Plus you accrue that evidence and you get the social support for doing so. That's your best pathway forward. So there's this idea that Carl Jung developed. He extracted it, I don't know from where, from some ancient writings that he was familiar with. I believe they were Jewish writings. He said that, classically speaking, traditionally speaking, God was viewed to rule being with two hands, the right hand and the left hand, and the right hand was justice, and that was you're going to get what's coming to you. But the left hand was mercy. And the idea essentially was that the cosmos could not exist without the proper combination of justice and mercy. You should get what's coming to you. But people are fallible and they make mistakes. And so it's reasonable to apply that to yourself.
there's an idea that's been developed by psychologists over the last few decades that people are basically narcissistic and that they generally feel that they're better at most things than other people. I don't buy that. I don't think the experimental evidence for that is very strong, and I certainly haven't seen that, for example, in my clinical practice, where I've seen that people are generally far harder on themselves than they are on other people. One example of that, I've written about this in my new book too, is that if you have a pet that's sick and you take it to the vet and you get medication, you're very likely to give the pet the entire course of medication, to go to the pharmacy to get the prescription filled, to give the pet the medication, to follow it through. But if you are the person who has the problem, you all laugh because you know the story. It's like a third of you won't even go fill the prescription, and of the remaining 2/3 of you, half won't take it to completion. And you think, well, why are people like that? And I think it's because they know themselves, they have contempt for themselves because of their flaws, and then they come to despise themselves. And I think that's a big mistake. That's too much justice and not enough mercy. And Jung wrote about the biblical injunction that you should treat your neighbor as if he were yourself, essentially. But he talked about that as an equation, which was quite interesting. So, because it's often read as something like you should be nice to people, which is not what it means at all, because first, nice is a very low-end virtue, but it isn't what it means. What it means is that you should treat your neighbor as if he or she is someone that you wish to encourage and develop, but that you should also have exactly the same attitude towards yourself, which is sort of in some sense regardless of what your opinion is of yourself. Critical, let's say, hypercritical even, which is often the case with people who are anxious or perhaps who are hyper-conscientious. You have to put forward to yourself the same sympathy, we could say, that you would extend to someone else that you cared for. That's the thing, is that you have to come to treat yourself as if you're someone that you care for. And I mean that technically. You detach yourself from yourself and you think, okay, well, if I was going to construct a mode of being that was optimal for this person that I happen to be, what would that look like? And that's sort of independent of whether or not you think you deserve it. It's like, maybe you deserve it and maybe you don't. Innocent until proven guilty, that's a pretty good policy. But you should come to lay out a mode of being for yourself that gives you some credit, and that will also help you in your dealings with other people. But it's often very difficult for people to do that to themselves. Every time you make a status shift as you move upwards, of course you have imposter syndrome, because when you first make a transition into a new role, you are an imposter because you're a beginner. You don't know what you're doing. And that doesn't mean you're a liar or a fake. And it doesn't mean you should presume more knowledge than you have. It's, what did Nietzsche say? Every great man is an actor of his own ideal. And that feeds into the imposter syndrome in some sense. If you want to move to the next stage, at some point you have to act like you're already there when you're just barely started. And that's not a lie. It's the willingness. It can be, and it can degenerate into a lie, especially if you presume more than you know. But if you move, let's say you move from being an undergraduate to a graduate student. Well, all the other graduate students and the professors know that you're just a beginning graduate student. They're not going to expect as much from you as they would from a more seasoned graduate student. So you have some leeway that's genuine, but you are, the low-rung occupier of that role. And of course you're going to feel like you're an imposter if you have any sense, because you're just barely there. You just made the transition. That's okay. That's not a problem. First of all, you have to understand that everyone with any sense who isn't narcissistic feels that. And it's actually an indication of your mental health and your competence, as long as that doesn't become crippling. It shouldn't knock you out. I'm such a phony. Well, don't be a phony. That's the first thing. If you're dealing with competent people and you admit your ignorance, the competent people never judge you harshly for that, as long as you've been paying attention. So in my classes, for example, people were often afraid to ask questions. And so sometimes I would point to people and ask them if they had a question, especially the quieter types. And they'd be afraid to ask the question because they're revealing their ignorance. And they would assume they're the only person in the room that's that ignorant, but they're not, because if they were paying attention and they had a question, the probability that half the class had that question was really high. That's different if you're not paying attention. And so you can be ignorant, you can be an ignorant newbie, and you can even ask the questions that are necessary to ask in that position and sort of reveal your inadequacy. And as long as you're dealing with competent people and you've been paying attention, they're just going to answer your questions. And then you only have to be ignorant once. That's the thing about asking a stupid question. You only have to ask it once, then you're no longer stupid.
Okay, now, this young man told me that his life lacked purpose and direction and meaning, and that he was nihilistic until he read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book I actually like quite a bit. I've read it 3 times at different decades of my life. And one of the things that's very interesting about that book is that it's an examination of the idea of quality, of the idea that there are qualitative distinctions between things, and that we have an instinct to make qualitative distinctions. And so a qualitative distinction is simply, this is better than that, which is a judgment. Okay, now what Ratzinger is hypothesizing is that the person in and of, you know how the modern idea is you're supposed to accept yourself. I think that's an insane idea, by the way. Really, I can't think of a more nihilistic idea than that you're already okay. It's like, no, you're not. And the reason you're not is because you could be way more than you are. And so what do you want to be? You want to be okay as you are? Or do you want to strive towards what's better? And this young man, this Australian, he said that the reason that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance had such an impact on him was because he wasn't happy with his current mode of being, right? He didn't consider the manner in which he conducted himself sufficient. And the fact that the author of Zen, and it was Persig, laid out the notion that you could make qualitative distinctions, and there really was a difference between good things and bad things, or great things and evil things. It gives you direction. It gives you the possibility of moving upward. And Ratzinger is pointing out, at least to some degree, that human beings are insufficient in and of themselves and need the movement upward. And so they need to conceptualize something like the highest good, and then to strive for that. And the thing is that there isn't any difference between conceptualizing the good and being judged. Because if you're going to conceptualize the good and move towards it, what you have to do is separate from yourself all those things that aren't good and leave them behind. And that's why the Redeemer and the Judge are the same thing. And one of the things that's really appalling, I think, about our modern world is that we're rejecting the notion of qualitative distinctions. You say, well, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying that one thing is better than another. It's like, okay, fair enough. It's not fun to be cast off with the damned, that's for sure. But if people are, in fact, insufficient in their present condition, which seems to be the case, I mean, try finding someone who isn't, then if you deny the possibility of qualitative distinction because you want to promote a radical egalitarianism, then you remove the possibility of redemption, because there's no movement towards the good. And it seems to me that it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for, well, it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for the equal. Because for us to be equal would mean, as far as I can tell, that we would all be equally unredeemed and miserable. What we mean by soul is something like animating spirit. And you might say, well, what's a spirit? And well, that's actually rather easy to answer. So when a child of 4 is playing house, let's say when a child of 4 is playing house, she acts out the role of the mother. But acting out, that's a strange thing, right? Because she doesn't literally duplicate in her actions or her perceptions in the game what she observed her mother literally doing. So, for example, she didn't go into her mother's bedroom when her mother awoke and watched her turn her head in a particular way to awaken and count the number of blinks so that she could mimic that in her play. And you think that's absurd, but it's not absurd if it's just mimicry. It's not.
It's unbelievably sophisticated. So what the girl does is she watches her mother manifest maternal behavior across a vast array of instances, and she integrates that with the image of the mother she's received from all the books she's been read and all the little movies she's watched, the Disney movies and so forth, and she abstracts out the animating principle of the maternal, and then she embodies that in play, and usually with a little boy, and that's practice for what's going to come later. It's unbelievably sophisticated, and she's embodying a spirit, and the spirit there is the abstraction of the central animating principle from multiple embodiments of its manifestation. And if you think children can't do that, well, then you don't know anything about children, because they do that all the time in their pretend play, which is a necessary precursor to healthy psychological development. And so part of what we refer to as the soul is the presence of that spirit, or maybe even the capacity of embodying such spirits. And it's very difficult to know how deep that goes. You know, I had a vision at one point of all the men in my life who've been particularly influential in a benevolent way. You know, and you think, well, just the mere notion of the idea that there could be a benevolent way that would unite the acts of benevolence across a series of men, that's all comprehensible to you. You take that as a matter of course when you say that there are such things as good men, and you can identify them, right? Something stable about whatever is good across multiple manifestations of incarnation, let's say. And I saw that transform into the Father person of the Trinity as the embodiment of that benevolent spirit. Now, I don't have any idea what that means metaphysically, because who does? But that spirit manifesting itself within is certainly part of what we refer to when we talk about the soul, and you can see that shine through people. I mean, it's part of what gives someone charisma. It's part of what elicits the instinct to imitate in you. You know, and you see that even in simple things. When you see a remarkable athlete do something incredibly athletic, to put the soccer ball, the football ball through the net, to score the goal, and everybody leaps to their feet in celebration of that, well, that's a celebration of the divine capacity to hit the target dead on. And it grips you at such a low level, way down inside your soul, that you're compelled to your feet to cheer, and you don't even know what you're doing. But you enjoy it, that's for sure, and that enjoyment is also a sign of the depth and utility of that response. You see this in all the things that people do that are, you know, so-called popular entertainment. It's unbelievably sophisticated. The soul is participating in that in the fullest extent. And, you know, you can say, well, there's no necessary use for the religious terminology. It's like, well, until you come up with a better word, there's plenty of use for it, because it's a very complex and deep phenomena. And to, you know, just cast it into the realm of superstition in some casual manner it's just not helpful. Not in any possible. It's not helpful scientifically. It's not helpful ethically. It's not helpful existentially. Try treating someone for a while as if they don't have a soul. Just really, I mean it. Just, you know, treat them like a deterministic machine, if that's your belief. Really act it out. You'll be like the most hated person in town in about 15 minutes. Well, I mean, what do you make of practical evidence like that? I mean, you interact with people as if they're free souls capable of choosing between good and evil. That's what you do all the time. And maybe you can addle yourself out of that by some ridiculous rationalist ideology, but that just means you're kind of a gabbling fool, and it's just going to make you trip over things you don't even notice in all of your social interactions. I don't care how you think philosophically or ideologically, you bloody well know that what I just said is true. So, and that's true even when you're interacting with an infant or a small child. It's true when you're dealing with someone who's elderly and virtually incapacitated in every way. You still see that divine spark, for lack of a better term, and we do lack a better term, by the way. You see that everywhere if your eyes are open and if you're willing to see it, and to the degree that you're responsive to that, then your actions are guided by love and your words are guided by truth. Maybe we could start our discussion of sexual differences in mating strategy with that. So first of all, what's the evidence that suggests that women are in fact choosier when it comes to sexual partners than men, and how much choosier are they?
Okay, great question. Well, so maybe first we could just define for listeners what sexual selection theory is. Because most people, when they think about evolution, they think of survival of the fittest and that sort of nature redding tooth and claw.
Yes, and a kind of a randomness too, which, that's kind of implicit in the natural selection theory, whereas sexual selection is anything but random.
Yeah, absolutely. So sexual selection, so if natural selection, this is oversimplified, but is the evolution of adaptations due to their survival advantage, or the survival advantage that accrued to the possessors. So things like fear of snakes, fear of heights, spiders, darkness, strangers, and so forth, food preferences, things that led to better survival. Sexual selection deals with the evolution of qualities that lead to mating success. And Darwin identified two causal processes by which mating success could occur. One is same-sex competition or intrasexual competition. And the logic there is that whatever, he thought about it in terms of contest competition, where there was a physical battle, like two stags locking horns in combat, with the victor gaining sexual access to the female, loser ambling off with a broken antler, dejected with low self-esteem and probably needing some psychotherapy. But the logic was whatever qualities led to success in these same-sex battles, whether it be athleticism, strength, agility, cunning, or whatever, those qualities got passed on in greater numbers due to the sexual access that the victors accrued. Qualities associated with losing basically bit the evolutionary dust. The second component, so that's intrasexual competition, which actually the logic is more general than Darwin envisioned. So like in our species, as we were alluding to, we often compete for position and status hierarchies. And so we can engage in intrasexual competition without engaging in this physical battle or contest competition, although I think that the contest competition was also part of human evolutionary history with males. The other component process is basically what Darwin called female choice. And the logic there is that whatever qualities, if there's some consensus about the qualities that are desired, that men possessing the desired qualities have a mating advantage. They get preferentially chosen. Those lacking the desired qualities basically become incels or involuntarily celibate. They get shunned, banished, or ignored. Now, the twist on that, and so I think sexual selection is by far a more interesting process and definitely has occurred with respect to humans. But the twist there is that we have mutual mate choice, at least when it comes to long-term mating, especially when it comes to long-term mating. And that gets to the issue of Trevor's theory of parental investment, where he asked the question, well, which sex does the choosing? Which sex does the competing? And his answer was the sex that invests more in offspring tends to be choosier. Sex that invests less tends to be more competitive for access to those desirable members of the opposite sex. But in long-term mating, now we know from our reproductive biology that women have that 9-month pregnancy, which is obligatory. So women can't say, look, I'm really busy with my career. I really only want to put in 3 months. It's just part of our reproductive biology to produce one child. And men can produce that same child through one act of sex. And so women are, at least when it comes to sex, the choosier sex, the higher investing sex, in part because the costs of making a bad mating decision are much more severe for women than for men. Man and woman hook up, have sex for one night. In the morning, they both realize, oh, this is a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. Well, if the woman gets pregnant, then she might be pregnant with a guy who is not going to invest in her offspring. A guy perhaps is someone that has poor genetic material. It does not have a robust immune system, etc. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question about sexual selection. You asked about the evidence for females being choosier, and they are choosier primarily in the context of casual sex or short-term sex. So that's where you find the big sex differences. And so one of the classic, and there's a ton of evidence for this. This is a a sex difference that I capture in the book under the category of desire for sexual variety. So men have a much greater desire for, meaning a variety of sex partners than women do. And so the choosiness comes in on, I'll just give you one experiment. This is a classic study done by Elaine Hatfield and Russell Clark, where they had male and female confederates, which for listeners are members of the experimental team. It doesn't mean people from the South United States. But they had male and female confederates simply walk up to members of the opposite sex on a college campus and say, "Hi, I've been noticing you around campus lately. I find you very attractive. Would you," and they asked them one of three questions, "Would you go on a date with me tonight? Would you come back to my apartment with me? Would you have sex with me?" And it was a between groups design. So they simply recorded the percentage of individuals who agreed to these three different requests. And of the women, about half, about a little over 50% agreed to go out on a date with the guy. 6% agreed to go back to his apartment. 0% agreed to have sex with him. Most women need a little more information about the guy before they're willing to have sex. Of the men approach, also about 50, by the female confederate, about 50% agreed to go out on the date, 69% agreed to go back to her apartment, and 75% agreed to have sex with her. And so if you talk about choosiness, are you willing to have sex with a total stranger who you've met for 30 seconds? Women unwilling to, and in general, men very willing to. And this is a study that's been replicated now in several European studies. Very difficult to do this, as you might imagine, to get this by the IRBs or ethics committees in the United States anyway. I assume it's similar in Canada.
Or worse.
Or worse so, but yeah, the kinds of studies we really want to do are more difficult to do nowadays. But it's been replicated in several Western European countries. And you can get women off of the 0%. You can get a few percent of the women saying yes if the guy's really, really charming. If he's Brad Pitt or I don't know what the modern equivalent is, Ryan Gosling, which is one of the, or perhaps a famous rock star. But that's one illustration of the answer to your question about, well, what is the evidence for female choosiness? Now, the interesting thing, I'll give you one more. So there are studies that ask, what is the minimum percentile of intelligence that you would accept in a potential partner? So, we explain percentiles to people so they understand 99th percentile, first percentile, 50th, and so forth. And basically for things like a marriage partner, men and women are roughly equal. They both are very exact. And they say what they want, like say 65th, 70th percentile in intelligence. Where the sex difference comes up is just a sex partner, a pure sex partner with no investment. Women still maintain, they still want, let's say 60th or 60 plus percentile in intelligence, whereas men drop, to embarrassing levels. That doesn't really, it becomes irrelevant. If 35th, 40th percentile men go, if she can mumble a little bit, that's fine, or even not. So that's another indication of female choosiness, that is, they maintain greater choosiness when it comes to short-term sex, and are simply less comfortable with having sex with total strangers.
We certainly choose each other for self-awareness and consciousness and intelligence. And I don't, if you're choosing a mate, there's an arms race in human beings. We're choosing intelligent mates, that's especially the case for women in relationship to men. So that the idea that that's a choice, well, that's partly why it's Eve that makes Adam self-conscious in the Garden of Eden, right? She offers him the apple. She's the one that makes him self-conscious. And I think that's actually accurate, because the evidence from the evolutionary biologists is that female sexual selection was one of the driving factors that differentiated us from chimpanzees. It's a major factor. Chimpanzee females are not selective maters. They go into estrus, they'll mate with anything. What happens is the dominant males chase the subordinate males away, and so they end up leaving more offspring, but it's not a consequence of selection on the part of the females. In human beings, it's completely different. Concealed ovulation and intense selection pressure from women on men. You have twice as many female ancestors as you have male ancestors. And people can never have a hard time working that out arithmetically, but it's not that problematic. You just think on average every woman had one child, half of men had none and the other half had two. And that's approximately correct if you average across the entire history of human sexuality. So human males in particular are subject to vicious selection pressure on the part of females, and I also think that's partly why nature is represented symbolically as female among human beings, because after all, nature is what selects. There's no better definition of nature than that which selects.
Imagine you ask something like, well, what's the meaning of life? And I would say, well, you should reformat that question, because it's not a good question, because it implies that there's a meaning to life, a meaning. And perhaps there isn't a meaning. You could ask, well, where do people derive the meanings in their life? Well, you tell me, but I'll make a little list and see if you can add to it or object to it. You probably need a career or a job. Well, why? Well, because otherwise you'll starve and freeze. Like, it's a necessity. You have to generate enough to protect you from the elements, let's say, to protect you from privation. That's not a consequence of capitalism or anything foolish like that. It's a consequence of hunger and the need for shelter. Capitalism is an attempt to address that, not to cause it. And you could argue that another system might do it better, but even if you did argue that, you can't lay the necessity at the feet of capitalism. You need a career and a job, partly out of necessity, partly because we need to be of service to other people. We need to be of service to the community. It's a deep need for people, especially if they're conscientious and agreeable. You need to be educated to the limits of your intelligence. You need an intimate relationship. You need a family. You need friends. You need to take care of your mental and physical health. You need to regulate the effects that temptations have on you. And you need some sort of higher order spiritual or philosophical pursuit. Well, those are all socially mandated roles to some degree. And you don't want to demolish them because you're left with nothing. Having nothing is not a good place. It's not freedom. That's foolish to think that. Freedom is the ability to choose between jobs, let's say, not to choose whether or not you have a job.
When I was younger, when I was 10 or 12, I used to think that being an adult meant doing whatever you want. It's only when I got older that I realized being an adult actually means having responsibility. A sign of maturity isn't doing whatever you want whenever you feel like it. It's having obligations and responsibilities toward other people.
You just made a case for identity as social responsibility and duty. That's a lot different than identity as felt sense. I mean, it's just not helpful to have your identity be your felt sense because it doesn't buy you anything. And you pointed out that for you, there's some peace in fulfilling your roles properly. So you have a number of games which you chose to some degree voluntarily, but which are also socially structured. You find satisfaction and freedom from anxiety in playing out those roles properly. And that is what people are like. And demolishing those roles, criticizing them as purely oppressive, let's say, is not helpful because it leaves nothing. And that's a terrible state for people to find themselves in, to have nothing. You're very fortunate if you're constrained by a number of functional roles. It's what everybody needs. I mean, some people need less of that than others. If you're highly open in your personality, so fundamentally creative, and you're low in conscientiousness, so you don't like order, you don't need order, well, a little bit of structure goes a long way, but there aren't many people like that who are highly functional. It's also extraordinarily difficult to make your way in the world as a spontaneously creative person. It's very difficult to monetize that. Some people do it extraordinarily well. They're geniuses. Even they're very rarely economically successful. Belief is what you stake your actions on. Well, there's choice in it too, and that's faith, I suppose. So for example, faith isn't the decision to believe things that are preposterous. And there's a substantial amount of confusion about that, I would say, in the religious community and in the non-religious community. So for example, you can decide that it's better to tell the truth than not to. And it's a decision because you're not basing your action on your observations of the outcome of the actions that stem from that decision. You've decided to look at things in a certain way. So I could say, I've decided to do what I can to say what I believe to be true, because I have decided that, to believe that, to assume that, to have faith in the proposition that there's no better way forward than the truth, no matter what it looks like. And that's the thing. That's why the decision of faith is necessary, because it gives you a particular angle on the evidence. You know, maybe I say something I believe to be true and I get in trouble. And then I might say, well, the fact that I got in trouble indicates that saying what's true wasn't the right thing to do. It's like, no, not necessarily. It might be that saying what I believe to be true was the right thing to do despite the proximal outcome. You have to make decisions about how you're going to interpret the facts. You have to make decisions about that. Those are decisions of faith. And so then you decide what you have faith in. Well, here's some things that I would like to have faith in if I could manage it, if I could be strong enough to manage it, let's say. I'd like to assume that existence is worthwhile and that we should all work for its furtherance and its benefit. And you say, well, is that true? Well, there's a lot of suffering in life. There's a lot of suffering associated with consciousness. You could make the case that there's so much suffering that the whole game is suspect. And that's a valid claim, but it's not a claim I want to make. So I'm not going to live out that claim. I'm going to try to live out the alternate claim. All things considered, I think that would be better. You could say, well, you're justified in altering falsehoods if it's expedient. That's why people lie, and people do lie, and so obviously they believe that to some degree, because otherwise they wouldn't lie. But you could decide that you're not going to do that because that's wrong. Well, that's not so much an observation as a proposition. I'm going to live my life as if that's wrong. And I've derived both of those principles, let's say, the wish for the furtherance of being and the idea that truth is redemptive. Those are fundamental Judeo-Christian propositions, maybe the most fundamental Judeo-Christian propositions. They seem to me to be valid, or valid enough to stake my life on. And that's the decision of faith. What are you going to stake your life on? That's manifested in action. It's not manifested in your claims about the explicit contents of your descriptions of the world. This ideal does lurk in our structure. And, you can say, well, it's the internalization of a social ideal. It is that. It's more than that, though. It's probably the internalization of a biological ideal. But it's more than that, because why that biological ideal? Why did that manifest itself rather than some other ideal? These are all ideas I'm trying to work out while I'm writing this next book. See, well, I can give you a bit of a prodrome of that. Men, roughly speaking, gather together in groups to accomplish tasks they regard as significant, important. And they vote among themselves, so to speak, as to who they'll elevate to a position of status and authority. The men are constantly getting together, deciding amongst themselves who they're going to hoist up on their shoulders and carry cheering out of the stadium. And women peel from the top of that. And so the men vote on the best men and the women select them. And that's our evolutionary history. That's sexual selection. We're participating in the joint creation of an ideal that's negotiated between the sexes. And I think that's undeniable biologically.